and his family moved from Alton, Illinois in 2016. This was the first time they moved without knowing what they would do. And they discerned that God was calling them to help a small struggling town become a little better. Within a year, they own a 12,000 square foot federal post office, and with the help of family and friends, turned it into Post Commons, which the locals call a living room for Alton. Under Hugh's nonprofit Lantern Network, Hugh facilitates a coffee house, brunch kitchen, event center, a whiskey society, and a co-working space to birth and nurture small ventures that make a collectively large ripple. He's written numerous acclaimed books such as The Tangible Kingdom, Flesh, Bible, and Sacrilege, and he's also founded Missio Publishing. He's now a coach and a creator of V3's one of V3's newest learning cohorts, which is the Marketplace Planting cohort. Of course, with us today, we also have Dan White Jr., who co-planted Axiom Church in Syracuse, New York. He is a strategist with the V3 movement, the author of Subterranean, the Church's Movement, and most recently, Love Over Fear. And he's also the co-founder of the Praxis Gathering in Philadelphia, which is a yearly gathering for pastors and practitioners to explore mission, discipleship, and reimagine leadership. So we're glad that they are with us today. And I am Lori Ruffin. I am the operations manager for the V3 movement and the founder of the COO team, which is a virtual operations agency for small businesses and nonprofits that builds their capacity. So with all of that, I introduce you to Hugh Halter.
Thank you, Lori, and thank you, Dan. Glad to be here. Everybody needs to buy Love Over Fear. There's my pitch for Dan. So hopefully that helps a little bit. Lori and Dan, please feel free to just cut me off at any time. If somebody has a question, I'd rather really work off of people's questions, but I'll take a little bit of time to frame this. Just real quick, everybody can hear me okay? We're all good?
Yeah, we got you, buddy.
Okay, man. Well, we will dive in. I'm grateful to be with you guys. I'm actually out in the woods of Central Oregon with my family, and they've given me a little break here. So I found a little restaurant side room. I'm hoping nobody comes in. So if it happens, it'll happen. I'll just move outside or something like that. But anyway, we if you know any of our story, most people do know our original work with the Tangible Kingdom, which was a story of a church plant out of Denver, Colorado. And we were really kind of coming on the scene at kind of the beginning of the contemporary missional conversation. And we were sort of a picture of doing church quite a bit differently, mostly as a network of missional communities. And that sort of story has gotten me traveling around the world the last 15 years. And interestingly, I never really talked much about the money part. If you've read The Tangible Kingdom, it's mostly kind of a quick deconstruct of attractional forms and then a reconstruct of what church would look like if you did it, as a team. And I mentioned in there that, that I had a normal job and stuff like that, but I didn't really dive into the sustainability aspects. And so it was probably 5 years ago that Exponential Church Plant DL and Zondervan asked me to take the missionary principles and apply it to a local church, and then to apply it to sort of a bivocational setting. So we launched a book called Bivo. I think that's probably been 4 or 5 years. And that was kind of the money story behind the Tangible Kingdom. So if you ever want to take a look at that, feel free to do that. But essentially, we were just saying, like if we went somewhere else in the world where nobody's going to come to our churches, we would have to assume that we'd have to live like a missionary. So we'd have to get jobs, and we'd have to figure out how, to squeeze out 10 to 15 hours a week for ministry in the context of a community of people that are all giving 10 to 15 hours a week. And so that, was sort of what we've been talking about. Interestingly, most of the speaking requests I've had in the last 3 years have almost been directly related to the funding or sustainability of missionary teams in America, especially. Every denomination is on the decline. And so the financial model of the church, which is really based on growing consumer Christians that are willing to tithe, and when I say consumer, I'm not saying negative, I'm just saying people that would come to church and they would say, well, that's my pastor and this is my church, and so we're going to fund that. That as a business model is no longer operational, simply because people are not coming as often, and most churches experience a pretty incredible decline. So that frames a new question for the church today: is, if we are in a pure missionary context, then we as leaders have to be missionary leaders. And that frames another question mark of, well, how did the missionaries in the New Testament do it? Paul, the apostle, he seemed to allow for somebody to make a living off of the gospel, workman's worthy of his hire, and don't muzzle the ox and all that. But we also see Paul, the missionary, saying, in a very specific context, he said, for you guys, I decided to work amongst you so as not to be a burden. So Paul's, at least in that missionary context, going, I can't just ask you to support me or fund me or respect me. I'm going to have to go ahead and work in the culture, and then let's see what happens. And so that's where we're coming from. When we talk about a marketplace cohort, I come from the perspective that I don't think in any of your cities people are looking to go to church. And so the only way that they're ever going to move towards Jesus and a community of Christians is that they're going to respect somebody enough to even be a friend, and then eventually to share their life, and eventually conversation, and then the formation of church occurs. And so that's what we're going to be doing with Marketplace Cohort, is talking about from the very moment you step in a context, what is good news for that city, and then if that good news includes business, then how do we move from a successful, well, number one, how do we create a successful business? And number two, how do we move from just business to the formation of congregation? And so if you've ever, I don't know if any of you read Bible or even the book And, which was about the gathered and scattered church, we talked about 3 sort of missionary processes, and I'll just go through those with you really quick. And again, it's if you went anywhere in the world, I'm going to actually move my phone here, which is propped up by notepads right now. Let's see if that works okay. So you go into any context, and the very first thing that you would have to do, let's just say you had 20 people, would be the engagement of culture. All right, so you can see that, right there. And if we engage the culture, that's all about friend making and street cred and doing things that cause people to actually want to hang around you. But if you begin to do that and people start to be, in your engagement process, and they start to move spiritually, then eventually you're going to be forming a community. So we're just working down the missionary flow is what we call it. And the formation of communities, what many of you have been reading about, maybe from myself or Dan or any of the missional speakers, but it's the formation of a community where Jesus is visible and he's proclaimed, and might be in a living room, might be in a back room of a restaurant, doesn't matter. But at some point, once you begin to engage people, you can't just invite them back to a church. And so that's why you have to begin to create sort of unique social structures where people can come together and begin to grow in their faith and understanding of Jesus. And then if you do that, then you would probably multiply a lot of those communities, because one of them is not going to be enough. You might only be able to get 12 people in your living room. So eventually you're going to go, okay, we've got a bunch of these little communities, and so now we've got to figure out how to structure that into congregation. And so, the very last thing you begin to do in a missionary context is actually figure out, well, what does church look like? Most of us, when we think about church, we start with church. So we might get a space or a gathering. We go, how do we get people to come to the gathering? In the marketplace cohort, we're going to really focus on churching it up later, after you've done some good missionary work, which may include the business. So hopefully that gives you some framework that I come from. I am going to, suggest, and even share a little bit of how we're in just beginning our 3rd year in Alton, Illinois. And if I was to call the church party, like actually say, hey, Hugh Halter is going to start a church gathering, right now, I literally think 150 people show up. The problem with that is that most of those people will have been inspired or drawn through myself and my family, and they will gather because it's a Midwestern context. They will say, oh, Hugh's starting a church, so therefore Hugh's my pastor. And they would then ask me to play that traditional role of doing everything for everybody, and then the movement would stop. And so right now, we're getting a ton of street cred. We're getting a lot of spiritual movement. People are actually coming to faith already. But we're going back to the exact story of forming communities first as the discipling environment, and then we will figure out later what coming together and multiplying and sustaining all those communities will look like. So hopefully that's a bit of a background. Any questions just about even sort of the setup for the rest of this talk today? Any questions coming in?
Yeah, one question, Hugh, might be helpful. If you could just kind of review the 3 missionary processes.
Yep. So the first one is engaging culture. And I always say that the only goal in engaging culture is to become a friend of people. So Jesus was a friend of sinners. So that entire process, whatever we have to do to become a friend, if Jesus, who had no sin, can be a friend of sinners, then I would suggest that we as sinners can still become friends of sinners. So, the engagement process is a lot about just hospitality, a lot of social time with people. But the nice thing about having a business, what I've learned is that it exponentially speeds up the engagement of culture because people are coming into your business. And so, when we moved into Alton, Illinois, we had no idea what to do. We just knew God had called us there. And I would go out and look for a cup of coffee, and there wasn't one. So for a town of 35,000 people, I could not get a cup of coffee. I also couldn't get breakfast. There also wasn't any place to hang around, as during the daytime. There's a lot of biker bars and evening stuff. But the question became, well, what would be good news to this town? And the first thing would be a place to connect where you can actually engage people. So that's why we started not just a coffee shop. It was going to be a full-scale coffee, brunch cafe, and event center. But I literally go in there every day from 8:30 to 11, and I just hang out, and I just say hi to people and welcome them. I bust their tables, and sometimes I sit down and talk. Sometimes they ask me questions. I usually, if it's been kind of a thing that I'm teaching, but if somebody comes in 5 or 6 times, I will actually walk up to them and say, hey, it's time for your 2-minute talk. And they usually look a little freaked out. I go, calm down. It comes with a free cup of coffee. But I just said, I can tell you're a regular. And if you become a regular here, you're going to be a part of our family. And it helps me to remember your name if you would just give me 2 minutes of your story. And so I've probably done that 200 times. And everybody loves it. And it's usually a 20-minute time or 2 hours. Had one 6-hour, 2-minute story. But this is what, when we talk about engaging culture, that's what it is. It's just somehow you're naturally relating with people where there's no freak factor. And obviously, if you don't have a business, sometimes that can be really weird. You can only go over to your neighbor's house so many times and knock on their door and engage before they actually think you're a stalker. So one of the great benefits of a business is people don't think you're weird if you come up and talk to them. So that's the engaging culture. The formation of community is just then when I've had a chat with a young gal that actually, this is a real story. She came in, I said, hey, time for your 2-minute story. And I started with, by the way, how's your day going? And she got a little bit teary-eyed. She said, not very well at all. And then by the time we were done 6 hours later, she had explained that she was going to end her life that day and just heard that there's a place that she could go. And so she began to share that. I connected her with some young women that were on our barista staff that are some of our missionaries. And today she's a part of one of our missionary communities. So that's the formation of the community picture. You begin to invite them into, sort of these social, spiritual gatherings that you're having, most of the time in homes. We would do it at our Post Commons building on occasion. And then, so imagine, and again, we're not multiplying yet. We've got 4 communities, so I guess we're multiplying a little bit. But when the pressure of all those relationships begin to converge around Jesus, people will ask about when we're all getting together. And so that's then that third part of the structure and congregation. For us, it's probably going to end up being an every other week, probably Sunday evening gathering. That's essentially what we did in Denver in the Tangible Kingdom story. It could be a monthly gathering for a while, though. So that part, the ecclesial structuring, I generally try to say you wait till you've reached lost people and let the lost people determine the most natural kind of gathering times for you all. So does that help a little bit, Lori?
Yes, thank you.
So any other questions that's coming up off the board right now?
So Hugh, can you hear me, buddy?
Yeah, man.
You're in some sense helping to reimagine the role of, and this is traditional language, but the role of a pastor. And so, most pastors are trained in how to preach a good sermon, how to, lead maybe their elder board and cast vision. What have you seen as the hardest shift for a spiritual leader or someone who's been trained, seminary trained, to be this kind of missional entrepreneur gatherer? I mean, where do you see the challenge and conflict and struggle?
That's a great question. When you said spiritual entrepreneur, I would call that apostolic, right? So it's the
Yes.
ability to go somewhere where there's nothing established and create some missionary dust, if you will. And I would say, Dan, just for me personally, the hardest part for me, because the apostolicness or the apostolic life, that's very natural for who I am. In fact, I'm actually terrible once it works. When there's 500 people all sitting around wanting to do church, that's when I go to the dark side. But
Yeah.
if you parachute me into any city and give me 3 years, and usually there's going to be 150 people that will have moved towards Jesus in some way. But consistently, from the tangible kingdom story to now, the hardest thing that I have to deal with is the existing non-apostolic understanding of the Christians that are with me. And so I have young Christians that are actually been on staff at parachurches, and they keep going, well, what's church? When are we going to do church? And I keep telling them everything we're doing is church in action. And I will try to help them to go, what you're asking me is, when are we going to gather the saints for worship or for training? And so I tell them, I have to remind them, we have been training every other Sunday night. We actually do a training for the leaders, and they'll go, well, what about our lost friends? And I go, well, do you have any yet? And if they go, well, I'm working on it, I'll go, let me know when that starts to move. But let's not put the pressure back on the church gathering before we actually put the emphasis on the church in action and learning how to make disciples of lost people. And I think that's that one missing link. People always want to leapfrog or jump over all the great missionary work that really needs to be done. And I'm pretty good at it. I mean, still, I would say it's a 3-year story of just beginning to get the street cred of the lost people that we're with. So I think everybody's going to mostly struggle with the expectations of existing Christians to slow down and actually do the work. As Paul would say, to do the work of the evangelist. It actually does take a unique work to do ministry to the harvest, right?
Yes.
And to begin to make disciples, you don't just make disciples from the harvest field. I think in almost any American city, it's a 2 to 3 year process before you'd even have to worry about congregational structures. That's if you're really trying to reach lost people. If you want to create a space for disenfranchised Christians that want to start over, you might be able to go faster, but I don't think you'll be able to move them into missionary activity unless you limit the ecclesial opportunities that you give them.
So this sounds like a challenge to patience, and there's an intentional and embraced slowness to what mission requires. Tell me a bit about the so while you're kind of incrementally building friendships, developing Christians to be present on mission, and slowing down the impulse of we got to get a worship gathering going, you're building a business, right, Hugh? You're trying to becoming financially solvent, so there's sustainability there. tell me a bit about the work of getting to a place of financial stability and opening a business. I mean, share some of your story, or maybe share some practices or best things that you've seen in your travels.
Well, I'm still just learning this part. We had, I've been more traditionally bivocational or co-vocational before I was a house painter in the first two church plants. So I didn't have to really provide a business for anybody else or employment for anybody else. This is the first time I've actually had to create like right now we have 9 employees. And I've never done coffee. I've never done food service, and I've never done events. But those things, I just had to assume if the Lord, when he leads you into a missionary context, the Lord knows what he wants to do. I always tell people it's kind of cool that when the Lord sent the Halter family to Alton and we had no idea what we were doing, that his decision was, hey, let's make Halter do a coffee shop. I think that's amazing to know that God knows. Now, if I did this in Denver or New York City, I don't think God's answer is a coffee shop because there are so many, right? So I think he said, let's send the Halters to this crappy little town where they have nothing, where they've lost all their industry. And let's let them provide a place that will not just give coffee, but it will create some new culture, some business culture. And that's what it's done. So, the sustainability part, and again, it was apostolic. So most apostolic functioning, you're raising money as well as relating with people. Right. So most of the time when I find apostolically gifted, they have either the natural aptitude towards some business. Some of them already have thriving businesses, and now they're going, how do I turn that into a church expression? But for those that, are getting off the runway, like we did without any idea, it was I'd say we're 1.5 years into the business right now, and we're just now sustainable. So, that first 1.5 years, I was having to raise money to cover payroll, and we didn't, still haven't really taken a dime from the thing. So I had to go out and sustain myself and pass, whatever financial revenues we had onto our staff, because half of our staff were a young missionary team that came to do the ministry with us. So they had to not only learn, the barista stuff, but they had to learn, the ministry stuff along the way. So I think that's the part that's going to be really fun in the cohort is I'm still learning it with everybody. And, like, for example, when you have a real business, you have to be professional. And so in my case, if the guys that I hired in the kitchen that were all from a hard edge, culinary background where they're dropping F-bombs and freaking out when there's a rush, if that culture in the kitchen becomes different than the culture out on the barista bar, then all of a sudden you have to decide between firing somebody and trying to disciple them to become a better human. And that's, so there are all these very unique things that happen when you're a business, because especially in small towns, if I don't treat, or if I don't, there was a day I was going to just fire this one guy because he just really had a crappy attitude, but he also had a terrible life and he wasn't a believer. So we came together as a missionary team and went, okay, are we going to fire Joe? And we all agreed we all wanted to, but we all said, what's the gospel say to us in this? Do we feel like God's asked us to give a longer runway to Joe and challenge him and encourage him? And so we chose that, and Joe's still with us. There's occasionally days I just want to hit him in the side of the neck with a salami, but he's getting better, and he's starting to move towards our community. So that's the crazy part of this. It's, I always tell people the hardest thing in the culture to do today, I think, is to plant a church, or maybe the second hardest thing. The first would be to plant a church and really do business well, where you're managing people and all that. So I would say I haven't totally figured out. I think hopefully that's what will be great for those that are in the cohort, is that I'm not an expert on nailing this. And I've found that nobody is. And when I hear people doing this around the country, they all go, oh yeah, that's exactly what we're having to figure out as well. But I think the long story of this is that if you ask people in Alton, what do you think of Post Commons? They would, I think 100 out of 100 would go, it's an amazing business with amazing people. And I think that's what we want. We want authentic street cred. We want an authentic story on the inside. And hopefully, we begin to glean from the harvest and form community from that as we go. But we're just, I always tell people we're a coffee, food, and events business. The coffee and the food in almost any context just barely covers, if any.
Right.
The events, Dan, are where we'll make money. So we might be 60, maybe 100,000 in the good this year because events are beginning to grow. So that's a little bit more of a story of the business side of what we're doing.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Hugh, you had mentioned a couple times just in passing, kind of a missionary team. It sounds like, even though I would perceive you as an evangelist on the fivefold, but you have a team of people that are together with you. You have kind of a discipleship core of people that are partnering with you in this. Do you speak to maybe the survivability of doing this solo, or doing this with a team, and kind of how that has contributed to your to what you're doing there?
I would almost say, and maybe Dan, you might have seen this, that every once in a while you find one person or one couple that somehow seems to be able to pull a rabbit out of the hat and create church around them. But I've never seen those people ever create a movement.
Right.
They can start a little church of 70 people, maybe 120, maybe they grow it to a mega church, but it's a personality driven, non-movemental setting.
Right.
So I would say, I don't even advocate for that. I don't think most people have the chops for that anyway. So I always go, why don't we take the easier, more family route and do this as a team? Our young missionaries, they're all early to mid 20s. I'd say they've never been trained in how to be a missionary. They're just Christians. Half of them are so jaded against the church. My work as sort of the apostolic father in the movement is to bring them into my evangelistic environments, let them see it, start to go, oh, stuff works, while I'm training them, while I'm helping them work through their cynicism, and while I'm helping them be a better manager for the coffee bar or event stuff. So it's kind of all tied together. And quite frankly, the more I do it, the more I realize when you're discipling somebody and having faith or being an encourager to other staff, you're actually discipling them in Jesus stuff. It might be even a more real discipleship. So if my chef, who also struggles with depression that I didn't know when I hired him, whose father is a pastor and is trying to get his faith again in the church, when I'm walking him through a day of depression and he doesn't even want to show up for work, and his wife calls me and I've got to dig him out of bed and sit with him for 3 hours. To me, that's the exact same disciple making as what we would just call, I guess, getting a few guys over at the coffee shop and doing a Bible study. So I think sometimes we just don't talk about it in a real way. Discipleship is teaching people how to live their life after Jesus. And all these real issues are the real issues. So that's why I go slow down with the church questions, because you can't, the church is just people. So if you can't disciple people through real life, and if you're not willing to give it years and years and years, then I don't know if we're ever going to be able to form a church.
Right. Tell me a bit, last question, and we'll take some from the crowd here. So the starting a business, and I participated in that here locally, can be stressful, and the tendency in starting a business is to work 80 to 90 to 100 hours a week, and burn yourself out, acquire hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt just to get your feet landed. How are you kind of dealing with that overwork culture and the tendency to just try to scrape for every buck, while being, hospitable and faithfully present, and not living into anxiety and stress and survival of the fittest. Are you picking up what I'm kind of getting at there, Hugh?
Yeah. How can you basically be a superhero and still, well, I mean, I'll just go back to the real story. The first year, it was almost all
Yes.
renovation of the building. So I was,
Yes.
I'd say it was 12 hours a day in the building every day, so long days. But at that point, I don't have a lot of people pressure, right? I'm just working. So
Yep.
I'm also raising funds. So we had to raise about $500,000 to renovate this old post office that had been boarded up about 60 years. So, it kind of, for me, it was seasonal. It was just a lot of hard physical labor. And then
Yeah.
when we knew that we were 2 to 3 months away from opening up, then I started to go find my staff. And that then became the almost like you're going to find your church planting core group. I'm trying to find my inner team, my managers. And I found those all the same month. And so then it was just beginning to form those people. And literally, that's when we started doing some of the spiritual practices together.
Yeah.
So that they realized they were coming into a mission environment, not just a business environment. And then once we opened, I'd say that first 9 months, I was with them all day, every day, because we were all learning together, from point of sale issues to alcohol purchase issues to, you name it, we were all doing it together. But I'm a year and a half in now, and I'm in Central Oregon for 2 weeks, and that baby runs like a top. So, I tell people there is in any startup, especially a business startup, any business person knows there is an upfront fee that you have to pay. Usually, call it a 2-year grind to make sure you're stable. Because if you're not stable, if you're constantly freaking out, I don't know if the Lord in his great love for people will keep adding more meat to your skeleton, if you will. So I would say take the time to really develop a strong, framework for what God's going to build on. But like right now, I'm thinking about starting another business that another gentleman's offered me just 1 block away. And I actually feel like I have the time to do it because the Post Commons, the 3 anchor businesses, they run themselves. I literally now just show up for those couple hours in the morning just to walk around and be relational. So, so that's hopefully that answers the story. Very heavy front end, and then slowly weaning yourself out of the parts that you don't need to do or are not good at.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thanks, Hugh.
Yeah.
Hugh, you have been giving a lot of great insights into your journey. We have someone in the audience whose wife is also named Cheryl, and they have read all of your books. They're really excited. The gentleman is a traditional pastor, and the wife is leaning more towards mission. And the question is, do you have any suggestions on how the pastor who's asking the question can join his wife where she's at, and so they can do this thing together?
Yeah, that's a great question. This is actually more common than you would think. Most existing pastors, when they hear stories like this, they go, "Hey, I would like to give that a go." I think the stats on the traditional single leader pastor model is that 90% would immediately take the financial buyout if they can make a living doing any other thing. So that tells you that there's going to be a massive shift away from the traditional expectations to this. But it's never just a clean break, is what I tell people. It's usually a season of years where you begin to pull yourself out of those traditional expectations, and you can still maintain the role. I actually think you can, if you were hired because you're a great teacher, I think you can still teach on Sundays, and you don't really have to get paid for it. Most pastors can do that. I show up to churches all the time and preach amidst all this other stuff that we're doing. So I would say if the wife has, she's got the passion, she's got the idea, she's got the vision, I would say get going. And then if the husband starts to go, no, we want to work together in that, I would just say start outsmarting the congregational expectations and just start shifting time. I literally, you know, I've done a lot of coaching with existing pastors. Most pastors know that nobody really knows what you're doing with your time, as long as things go okay on Sunday. And so I know a lot of pastors that literally pastor a church, and they give their church 10 hours a week, and they shift 30 hours a week to building missionary community in the neighborhood or starting businesses. So there's just lots of ways to think about that. But if, you know, if the wife's ahead right now on the business side, just go for it. And try to eventually work together. Although I don't think you'd have to work totally together. I see a lot of couples that literally have multiple aspects going on in their life, and they just recognize it all as building God's church.
Thanks. Great answer. And so there's also some curiosity around moving in and building a team while you're there versus bringing a team. Can you speak to maybe the benefits of one versus the other?
Yeah, you know, it used to always be that we would hive off an existing congregation to another suburb. And I think that works in suburbs. If you go into an existing town, we call it towny, you know, where people know everything. The hardest thing we've had to do is actually prove to people that we are one of them. And so I think, you know, again, you have to read your context, but if I rolled into Alton, the only reason why Altonians accepted us is that we started a coffee shop for them. And people came up to us later and said, we heard about you, we Googled you, these were pastors, and we didn't want you to come to town, quite frankly. So there was, you know, spiritual, I guess there was Pharisee leadership that didn't want competition, but there's also like an Altonian thing. If you're not from Alton, if you're from a town 20 minutes away called Edwardsville, where there's a lot more money, if I bring in all of my barista staff from Edwardsville, they actually would have not come. So I had to, you know, make specific decisions to only hire local if I could possibly do that. So I would use that same methodology. I would say if I'm going to go into an existing context, I want to go in with as few a number of people as I need to get the mission started, and I want to go local as much as possible. And again, give it the patience to let the locals find you.
Yeah, thanks for the insight. And so I'd like to kind of throw two questions at once at you. One, how do you come in when you are quote unquote a nobody? Like, we all know we're somebody to God, but when you can't be Googled and you don't have books that kind of set a tone for who you are, what would you recommend there? And then the complementary question is, how do we focus in on a community? Like, how do we do that?
Yes. Great question. Well, if you don't have a public profile, you're actually ahead of the ballgame. It actually hurts to have, you know, a Christian public profile. But I would say this is the great benefit of a business. Before I got the big Post Commons building, it was probably 3 months into Alton, I told Cheryl, hey, I can't find coffee, so I'm just going to go make a coffee shop. So, and it was kind of I guess a cute little idea. I just thought, well, I've never done that. But I was thinking, the best way to get into the city is to join the business community. And so I thought, if anything, if I start a little tiny kiosk coffee shop, at least I'll go get to meet a lot of people and stuff. So I still think that's the best play. You've got to somehow get in where you're serving the city and getting to know sort of the, as we call it, the game paths, where you watch the deer go the same direction, they make a little path. When you get into the business community, you actually really understand how the city operates. And you also learn how the government relates to the city. And you also learn how people view each other, who likes each other, who doesn't like each other. And I don't think you can figure that out as a pastor. I think the only way you can find out is be a part of the culture that already exists.
Thanks. So speaking of, you know, Post Commons and how you were getting established locally, can you just talk about the structure? Is Post Commons a separate entity from the church, or are they under the same umbrella? One of the listeners is asking about how to set it up so that the participants don't feel bait and switched.
Awesome question. Yeah. So we set up, the very first thing we set up was a nonprofit called the Lantern Network. So our governmental covering is under that name. And we specifically had a choice to set it up as a church nonprofit or a charitable organization. So we chose to set it up as a non-church entity. That way, if anybody ever tries to find out what we're doing, I didn't want them to see that our ultimate aim was to plant a church. I wanted them to see we're a charitable organization. We actually bylawed Lantern Network as a business incubator. And so we've actually been able to incubate 7 other businesses in our space. So if anybody ever asks us, are you legitimate? We can actually pull out the files and go, hey, here's the 7 small businesses that we've created or helped create. And then the church part all becomes subversive. The church building, the building of the church, we never talk about it. None of our meetings would ever be public. We'd never probably even have a public worship gathering because we're going to be a network of missionary communities. So that's really helped us to avoid a lot of that bait and switch type of feel. All of our personal ministry is sitting around tables or in our homes or whatever. So it's actually worked out really well. And I've noticed other networks do very similar things. If you want to check out another very similar network that we get coached from, it's called Common Threads out of Birmingham, Alabama. And they're also a coffee forward network where they've created 11 other businesses. They have about 100 missionaries now living in the poorest parts of Birmingham that all exegete their neighborhood and create usually some sort of a semi-sustainable practice or business while they create missional community. So, and all of theirs are very subversive. At least the spiritual side is very subversive. The business side is very public and upfront. So hopefully that helps a little bit.
That does help. And so how would you answer that question for churches that do have a public gathering expression?
Well, if you already have an expression, then the best thing you can do is to create other missionary movements outside of that. So if you have business leaders that are very kingdom-minded, they're very evangelistic or generally if they've started a business, they probably have some apostolic, mojo. It would more just be coaching them to create spiritual movement out of their business context. And if some of that muses into the, the attractional thing, there's nothing wrong with that. People will move to what's meaningful to them. And some people that, in fact, I've already had 2 people come to faith, and they found Catholic churches nearby because we weren't offering any public service, but I still disciple them. But Alton's a very Catholic town, so their whole family's Catholic, so they got confirmed and headed off into that. So I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but I still think whether you start from an existing context and move out towards missionary movement, or you start as a pure missionary network and build a congregation, I think you'll find less hassle going that second option. It's harder to move existing Christians into mission than it is to reach non-Christians across the board. So I still would say angle that way, but you're not stuck. If you have an existing congregation, you're not stuck. You just have to begin to reallocate where you spend your time and what you focus on.
Thanks. And so can you talk about this? Does it make sense to start for-profits instead of nonprofits?
I actually think it doesn't matter. We had to start a nonprofit because somebody donated the building to us and they wanted the write-off. And then I knew I would have to raise a lot of money. So if any business that you're doing, you feel like you have to raise funds and people are going to want a write-off, then I would say at least have a nonprofit arm to what you do. We're about to start a coffee roastery in our building, but we decided to actually make that a for-profit separate business. That will then rent space from our nonprofit. I've seen it also go the other way. You could start with a for-profit and then add a nonprofit element just to receive funds. And the funds could be for yourself as the apostolic leader, or it could be funds to actually build a business out. They're both legal, they're both moral, they're both good. But what I'm seeing more often is where you have both a nonprofit and a for-profit opportunity. I like the for-profit because it gives more tax dollars to the city, which is, I guess, a bad business idea that you give money away, but it builds so much street cred. We actually, on our nonprofit, we chose to still pay city taxes at the normal rate simply because we wanted to freak out the city employees in Alton. And they actually know, they're like, we don't know why you guys are paying, you don't have to pay these taxes, but we go, we came here to help this town. So in fact, the city gave us $75,000 to help the building because it was right next to City Hall. So I said, you guys gave us money to help us do this. So we're just trying to give back as much as we can. And that's been, even though we've lost money, it's been a huge help on, I guess, the street cred side.
Hugh, to affirm the kind of hybrid approach that I'm part of a very similar thing that you've been doing in Alton, and we have a nonprofit and a for-profit that are coexisting together. The non-for-profit has allowed us to raise money to renovate our building. The for-profit has allowed Salt City Coffee to thrive and hire and fire and consider new locations. So both,
Totally.
having both exist has created kind of a beautiful arrangement.
Yeah. And I've had two nonprofits. So when I go speak or train or people want to fund me personally, I actually run that money through the Forge nonprofit. So nobody in the Alton context even sees that I make other money outside of Alton. And that's been really helpful, because when people ask me, have you taken any money from the coffee business yet? I can legitimately say no. I'm out raising. Last year, a guy that I didn't know just said, hey, I heard what you guys are doing. It's a great story, and dropped a big chunk of money. I said, send that to Forge. I didn't want that money to flow through our local business or nonprofit.
There's just a quick resource. There's a ministry that I'm good friends with some of them called Treehouse Ministry, and they help churches start charitable nonprofits to start neighborhood social good enterprises. So they help with some of the details of that because it is, especially institutional traditional churches have a hard time imagining work, ministry, presence outside their church walls. And so Treehouse does a lot of good help on the legal and financial side of that stuff.
Yeah,
that leads us to a great question. So, which is, who would you recommend people reach out to in getting help with setting up, for-profit or nonprofit entities?
Well, I think I would just go through normal people, even in your church context, that have, that do that as a full-time job. I find that most of the time they all kind of know what to do. In our setting, we found it very rare. Like when I try to describe what we're doing, a lot of people go, how's that work? But my tax guy didn't. He goes, oh, it makes total sense. And I don't think that guy's even a believer. So, so we get coaching from normal tax people. We get coaching from some legal friends, some friends that, know the law. So I would just go there. I don't think there's a specific group of people that, can help you any better or worse. Usually there's somebody in your context that will be able to help you set that up.
Yes, I'm also familiar with the network, createdleaders.com. They have a framework for that integration.
There's actually just another resource to throw out there. There's over, and not every city has this, but quite a few cities do. I was just doing research on it earlier. There's 500 incubator startup business opportunities in cities. So in my city, which is a small city, about 100,000, they have 3 or 4 incubators where they help coach you to start a small business. You could potentially win a small grant of money, but learning, you want to. Some people could potentially think they have to learn this from Christians or from people who share their ministry passion. But I mean, the best people to learn from are local, affirming what Hugh said, and then really start exploring the incubators in your area.
And accelerators as well. That's another very popular term. Small Business Administration, SCORE.
Yes.
Yes. So we're almost at our time, but this is such a good question. I'm going to try to squeeze it in before we wrap up. Can you speak to the dynamic of what it looks like to hire unemployable or underemployed individuals in this missional endeavor, as an act of justice, and, thinking
Yeah.
of convicted felons and or immigrants, just
Yes.
that.
Yeah, my general philosophy, as I say, just like you would with the church plant team, start with people that can lift a lot of weight with very little sort of burden, because then you're going to be reaching lots of people that have lots of burden, right? So I always say, I made sure my managers carry a lot of weight, but we started to hire people that were coming from programs either out of, incarcerated situations or poverty situations. So far, all of them have been an absolute train wreck. And we decided we would just keep doing it because that's why we're sent to do that. And so, but we don't expect it to work. The deficits that are coming out of our impoverished cities are so bad. Just to get them to show up to work sometimes, like you'd have to go, literally we'd have to go pick them up because they don't have cars, they don't have transportation. So you just have to decide how much of the issue of justice and the gospel are to be reflective in your business. I think in the food service or something like that, it's just a part of the deal. But it only works if I have some really strong people that can manage that. And even if we had 100 out of 100 fail in our system, I think the gospel still calls us to do that because it does something for those people, it does something for us.
That's awesome. Thanks for that brilliant answer. We want to thank you, Hugh, for coming. And just to make this announcement for everyone who's on, we're really excited because we are launching our marketplace planting cohort. It's about starting businesses for a mission. We know that the church is invited to break down the sacred and secular divide by creating sustainable missional faith communities while contributing to social good in local neighborhoods. So this training and this cohort led by Hugh is going to really focus on weekly development and how to exegete the community that you're called to serve in order to determine what is the best business, learning what capital and funding realities should be considered, how to establish street cred for the common good, learning when and how to gather the church, discovering your entrepreneurial spiritual formation and practices. You would have in-time coaching with Hugh so that you can continue to dialogue and figure out what's right for your context. It also would include a 2-day immersion in Alton, Ohio with at the Post with Hugh, and then the 3-day training with the V3 Movement at the Praxis Gathering in Philadelphia. So we are accepting applications now, and that cohort will start in September. So we want to encourage you to register for that today. If you have not yet downloaded the V3 Movement app, you can do that from your phone, and then you will be able to apply for this cohort. But I would encourage you, if you have any interest in business and mission, you don't want to miss this opportunity for equipping that in a way that fuses both mission and business together. So with that, we want to thank you for your time.